So welcome everyone at the event, the webinar COVID-19 from the margins. This is Stefania Milan speaking to you from the University of Amsterdam, and I wish to thank the organizers, so the research priority area, global digital cultures of the University of Amsterdam. But of course, let be reassured, what we are going to do is just scratching the surface today, because the book is so rich. There's 75 authors, and we cannot do justice to all of them. We are lucky enough to have two of them with us today, and then we just hope to make you curious about a project that, in fact, is just trying to, again, make room for interrogating the first pandemic of the Datafied Society from the perspective of the disempowered. So where does this come from? So my name, as I said, is Stefania Milan. I'm an associate professor in media and digital cultures here in Amsterdam, and we meet today in the call. There are other 4 speakers. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves when I give them the word. So that's how we are organized today. So 3 brief introductions by myself, Emiliano Trede and Silvia Masiero, the editors of the book that you see at my back here, COVID from the Margins, that inspires the webinar today. And then we are going to be joined by 2 authors who are going to talk respectively about India and China, just to be very global. But the book goes much further than early India and China. So where did we start? So it was May 2020, we were all slowly coming out of the first lockdown, depending on where you were just out or getting in, or you name it. Nonetheless, all of us battling and making sense of this unprecedented situation, given our age and where we live. We've never been living through a pandemic of this epic proportions. And as the pandemic hit very close to home, so it started in China, but then it moved to a lot of Western countries and throughout the world, media coverage of the pandemic was indeed very much focused on home. So if you're in Amsterdam, then a lot of coverage was about the Netherlands. If you were in Italy, if you were in China, you name it, people were already dealing with what was happening at home in their own communities. This meant that we really lost the capacity to see beyond our nose, but also to see wide and far, and to see how other people that maybe were simply not represented in the data of the pandemic for a variety of reasons, were experiencing this situation. So it all started with a conversation with Emiliano Trede from Cardiff University and myself, which resulted in a blog post that was reflecting on the widening data gap surrounding the pandemic. The fact that, just to cite one piece of information, at the beginning of the pandemic, so about 1 year, so the beginning when the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic, so about a year ago, out of the 58 countries of Africa, only 2 had testing capabilities. Meaning, of course, Africa was then a black zone, like a black as in blind zone, black in the data set, right? In the global data set of the pandemic, in the sense that there were no cases being reported because simply there was no capacity to test. Now that number about the countries having ability to test increased to about half of the African countries who now have testing capacities. But you can see how the lack of data then reflected in a way or another in the general storytelling about the pandemic. Lack of data meant no cases, meant no concern, no ability to empathize with people beyond our communities. So that's how we started. We decided to make space within a project that already existed that Emiliano is going to introduce. It's called Big Data from the South, of Big Data Sur in Spanish. So we already had the blog up and running, and we decided to create a sub-blog called COVID from the Margins. And from there, we started publishing in many languages, giving the authors the possibility of publishing whatever language they prefer, contributions reflecting on the challenges and the opportunities of the first pandemic of the Datafied Society, seen from communities at the margins. Here I want to spend a couple of words to thank the sponsors, because without them we would not have had the chance to pay a small contributor fee to the authors in need, which then allowed a number of people to also make room in their busy agendas to write something for us. There were moments in which we published even 3 blog posts a week. which was, of course, a major editorial effort because a lot of these authors didn't have much experience with writing in English, or they were junior authors, or simply we had to crowdsource for editors in other languages because the three editors, are not expert in all the possible language that you can write on. So this is how COVID from the Margins was born, and with fundamental seed funding, if you want, by the Amsterdam School of Cultural Analysis, a School of Humanities at the University of Amsterdam, who offered this money for authors in need, the European Research Council through the Data Active project. And given I'm coming to the end of my 5 minutes, I also want to thank them, the sponsors that made the book that you see here at the back possible. And this includes the two university priority areas of the University of Amsterdam, Global Digital Cultures, with we're very proud to be hosted by them today, and the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. Without these small pots of funding, small but really significant when you're trying to work with no funding at all, allowed us to take on this beautiful book that we could print and make open access thanks to another funder, another fundamental contributor to the project, which is the Amsterdam-based Institute for Network Cultures by Gert Loving, who then help us to take on the project and is also contributing to print the copies that we want to distribute for free around the world. We are still waiting for them. So this is the context. And I would like to now pass the baton to Emiliano to, go into the meat of the project.
Yeah, thank you, Stefania. Thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to be here, and I joined Stefania in thanking the sponsors of this initiative. I think that we demonstrated that it doesn't matter sometimes if it's just small pots of money. The thing is that they come when they are needed. They come at a time when definitely we needed to get this done. There was a time frame within which this needed to go out, and I really thank all of you and the global priorities areas of University of Amsterdam for that, and a small pot of money also from my school, which I'm proud of, the Cardiff University, the School of Media Culture, Journalism, Media and Culture, JOMEC. Well, without whom we couldn't have done this. I mean, it's really an ambitious project, but also a project out of passion, and a project which I think we consider it a spin-off of the major Big Data Sur, Big Data from the South initiative that was launched now 4 years ago. Wow, time passes so fast, so quickly. In Cartagena de las Indias in Colombia, when me and Stefania in a pre-conference OIAMCR, we joined together and we tried to imagine different ways of seeing, conceiving, approaching, imagining datafication. In what we said, it's the many Souths with this plural view of the South that inhabits our world. And this plural concept of the South informs all the initiative. The initiative is made up of many things, academic contributions, special issues. One is forthcoming with Palabra Clave, another multilingual endeavor, which is going to be with us hopefully in July. Another one with television and new media was out, and it was a success 2 years ago. But we also have meetings, we have exchange of ideas, we have these kind of slow traffic newsletter that we use, and you can spread and you can share different things and many more things. And connected to this plural conception of the South, not just the global South, which we feel that somehow has this kind of geographical limitation to it, that somehow tend to limit the debate. We thought that for this particular volume, for this particular contribution, we wanted to have something that speaks to another concept, and in dialogue with another concept, that is that of the margins. The margins, of course, it also retains the plurality of this, retains the plurality of the many peripheries of the world, and the voices that are unheard, the marginalized communities, the oppressed communities, as Stefania said before, the communities that are not at the center of the narration, the communities that are not at the center of the light, that are not illuminated by the light of the media, that are not at the center of the map of concerns in this datafied pandemic. But at the same time, it is connected to this idea of in community media developed by Clemencia Rodriguez. So we reconnected somehow these to a Colombian researcher who we deeply respect, and we sort of moved this to the realm of datafication and the Datafied Society in times of pandemic. And I think we did these this kind of conceptual operation to frame the whole volume that, as Stefania says, it's impossible to even scratch in 5 minutes, in an hour or so, because it's so rich, so plural, so vivid, and so intense, that I think it's one of the richness. It's something that will accompany us, and many of us, and you, I hope, in the years to come, as it's somehow this pluriversal, multilingual, and really rich, and also difficult to frame, I think, unorthodox kind of endeavor. So this is what I'm really proud of. This is something new, this is something that somehow breaks the traditional boundaries also of the editorial process, as Silvia will tell you later. Another concept that somehow informs this our understanding of this on the contribution is here, but also beyond this book, is the concept of data poverty. A concept we've been playing with in the last year to kind of address the fact that it's not enough to talk about big data rich and big data have-nots. This is a new kind of poverty that has emerged with the pandemic. We're talking about the mere existence of people on the map of concerns. We're talking about policymakers increasingly relying on calculated publics to make decisions, allocate money, public resources, healthcare, vaccines, as we are seeing in the last month. So as a result, the people existence is increasingly connected, yoked to data, as the COVID health crisis has made, I think, evident to everybody. So being datafied in this kind of context, visible to the state, of the community, etc., might be for many people, for many disempowered, marginalized communities, that is now the conditio sine qua non of survival, the conditio sine qua non of care. Undocumented migrants, low-income families, gig workers, indigenous people, domestic violence survivors, they are all in the book. Their voices are heard here, and they document their situation. So data poverty is exacerbated by fundamental inequalities predating the Datafied Society, but also aggravated by the limited citizen agency that in this complex ecosystem of data extractivism. And we think, and here I conclude, because as Stefania was saying, as an Italian, I could go on possibly for like 2 or 3 hours without even noticing, is the fact that we feel that this concept somehow is a bit more inclusive, and maybe it goes beyond the reflection on or it includes, and it somehow it's imbricated with data colonialism, but it's somehow something that comes before, as some people don't even have concerns regarding privacy. They don't have that privilege. They don't have that luxury. It's something that predates, that's something that comes before, in a kind of a rawer form. And we think this encapsulates these two concepts, the margins and the and data poverty, that and the relation between data poverty and the conceptualization by Silvia, and thus also are able to kind of encapsulate this, frame this. Although I have to say, this is unframeable, and this is willfully something that we don't want to be framed within traditional kind of conceptualizations. It goes beyond, it exceeds It's something that goes beyond every kind of intent to do it, and it has to be like that. So I hope these coordinates are able to situate you a bit on this and the richness of it all, and in connection to Big Data Sur and the Big Data from the South initiative. And I leave the word now to Silvia. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Emiliano, and thanks again to the Global Digital Cultures Initiative from the University of Amsterdam for hosting us today. I'm just reiterating what my amazing co-editors said. It is a great pleasure and indeed a great honor to be able to present the titanic effort that this book was here today. And just picking on one of the points that Emiliano made about the editorial effort, when we realized we are talking about 75 authors from 5 different languages with a total of 282, just wanted to put some numbers here, pages of narration of the first pandemic of the Datafied Society. Indeed, from the margins, we thought, wow, this is indeed an effort. And I have to say that seeing the blog growing, and in passing, I just make the quick note, the blog is still active, and we publish now with a periodic frequency of at least weekly still. The narrations that we receive from the different souths of the world, as Stefania and Emiliano said. So very much amazing to see the book in print and amazing to launch it with you here today, but very much an effort in progress, for which we very still welcome everyone's contributions. And Stefania has just put the link to the blog here in the chat. So again, we really welcome everyone's contribution to this titanic ongoing project. I just want to illuminate one more concept that really drove our theoretical effort behind this book, and that's the concept of the datification of anti-poverty programs that Shomo, that is going to present later today, and myself started playing with a couple of years ago while studying biometric systems in social protection in the Indian context. So, as Emiliano noted, the whole idea of data poverty looks at how marginalization translates into the fact of being non-counted, and the importance of being, the consequences of being non-counted in a crucial moment such as a pandemic. At the same time, to be counted in the social protection context, one nowadays needs to be datafied. So the whole idea of datafied anti-poverty programs is that of matching human identities with their entitlements within a certain system of programs. So for example, Sylvia, as a recipient below the poverty line, has this household size. That means these entitlements. And an algorithm is going to be able or not to assign her such entitlements. Now, what does this mean in the context of a global pandemic is very much illuminated, especially in the section 3 of our book, which is titled exactly Datafied Social Policies, and illuminates several forms of consequences of what datification meant for recipients of social protection in the pandemic. And I'm very happy to share the book tells also positive stories. For example, the story of India, where a large biometric distribution program, the public distribution system that in many states, that's a large food security scheme that in many states is conditional to biometric access. That biometric access was suspended in the wake of the pandemic, not only due to disease transmission through touch screens, but especially due to the consequences of datafied systems on the limits to inclusion of users. So the book tells hopeful stories, and here is another encouragement to engage with those positive narratives. Sadly, the book also narrates stories of injustice that the authors of our collection largely frame as data injustices. In this sense, the book makes a strong thread of connection, and I see several of the colleagues studying data justice in COVID-19. The book makes several threads of connection with, for example, the project published by the Midspace Press by Taylor, Martin, Sharma, and Jameson recently on data justice and COVID-19. Because in the social protection space, several forms of injustices appear, for example, informational injustices. So users of social protection not really knowing how exactly the algorithm matches existing data regarding their eligibility. Design-related injustices. So, for example, cases in which targeting, so biometrically enforced targeting, instead of being reduced, as it is when biometric schemes are suspended, is actually strengthened in order to maximize the whole idea of tackling inclusion instead of exclusion errors in the pandemic. So I finish here, but again, I just wanted to highlight the datification of anti-poverty programs very much as a third, in a way, in addition to the margins and data poverty, as a third illuminating light through the collection. And again, thanks very much everyone for being here, and we really look forward to feedback and thoughts on how everyone will engage with the narrations that we sought to collect in the book.
Thank you, Silvia. And I'm going to just make the transition to the first of our author presentation with Kinoko Merini, who is not in video today. And but she has a presentation to entertain us. I just want to say that there are 75 authors, and we could have picked any of them. We are going to host a number of book presentations where we are going to regularly feature different authors. So I see some of them in they're participating in our event today, and I want to big shout out to them for contributing to this amazing collective project. But without further ado, I would like to give the word to Kinoko Merini, who is going to share a story from China.
Thank you, Stefania. I'm Kinoko Merini, a PhD candidate studying new media technologies, and due to personal reason, I will be joining us today only with my voice, but I hope you enjoy my presentations anyway. It's an honor for me to be able to participate in this book launch with Big Data from the South Initiative and Global Digital Culture, so thank you for inviting me. This book, COVID-19 from the Margins, as already mentioned by Emiliano and Silvia, addresses different perspectives of the social impact that this global pandemic has put forward. It asks so many urgent questions, from corona tracking apps and health data monitoring in different contexts to who is being invisible and thus excluded from the subsidized systems, to how the pandemic amplified the precarious conditions of platform laborers, such as food delivery riders who cannot stop working. And I'm very excited to be able to bring my ideas among all these different urgent concerns into the discussion. This is the article that I contributed to the book. And before I start, I would like to take this opportunity to thank your room from Data Active for reviewing the article. It was May 2020 when I started to write the article. And back then in the Netherlands, we were still going through the first lockdown. While in China, the lockdown of Wuhan city, the ground zero of the pandemic, was lifted on 8th of April, marking a date when China fully reopens its economic and social life. And then quickly, we witnessed the official narrative turn to the heroism of the healthcare workers and the victories of the country's crisis management, also turning the public attention to the global outbreak. However, Chinese citizens haven't forgotten that since the very beginning of the coronavirus being detected in Wuhan, it is tightly entangled with information censorship. December 2019, several medical workers, including Dr. Li Wenliang, used their personal social media accounts to warn people in Wuhan about the rapid spread of a SARS-like virus. But the local governments forced them to silence and stigmatize them as spreading rumors and misinformation. As you can see from the screen here, this is documents that Dr. Li Wenliang signed with the local police department, promising not to spread misinformation and cause social instability. But as the epidemic developed, Wuhan's hospitals were flooded with patients. People quickly realized there was no rumor. Dr. Li Wenliang himself was confirmed infected with coronavirus and died on 7th of February. His death triggers people's anger towards the strict control of free speech. As we can see, young people and activists started the social media campaigns protesting against his experience. As my article discusses the ways in which citizens, journalists, and activists were brought together by digital network communities to fight for the right to be informed with accurate information. Censorship is, of course, not a new topic when discussing Chinese internet culture. However, with this article, I want to emphasize that we ought to be alert not to treat the censorship and the issues of free speech as an absolute top-down oppression. There are multiple layers of complexities, including the interests and conflicts between local governments and the central government, and also the interests of Chinese tech companies. Today, what I'm going to talk about is, despite the strict censorship, Chinese citizens are not passive receivers of the official narratives. They are well aware of the issues of free speech, and they are trying to come up with alternative and creative ways to combat the censorship. Due to the time limit of today's section, I'm going to talk about two cases I mentioned in the article, and we'll elaborate a little bit on my takeaways. So first, I would like to talk about how GitHub has been transformed into a new frontier for digital activism in China, in particularly during the corona crisis. So for those who are not familiar with GitHub, GitHub is an online repository for software development, version control, and source code management. Put it simply, it is a platform for hosting, storing, editing, and sharing code, mainly used by software developers. During the COVID crisis, citizens use web crawling or other data collection process to transfer the investigative journalist reports and individual writings to GitHub, racing against the speed of censorship. For instance, this project is called Terminus 2049. It was set up in 2018 to archive articles that were censored from mainstream media outlets and social media platforms such as WeChat and Weibo. As stated in its GitHub page, its slogan is "No more 404." 404 is an error code indicating that a server could not find the requested page, and it always refers to the Chinese state's strict censorship. So during the outbreak of COVID-19 in China, Terminus 2049 also archived and documented various reports and articles that has been censored or removed, including a series of in-depth reports questioning Wuhan local government's early stage reaction to the coronavirus published by Caixin Media. On the 19th of April, 3 volunteers from Terminus 2049 were detained by the authority. One of the volunteers has been released after 25 days, while Cai Wei and Chen Mei, the two main organizers of the project, are currently still under detain. And this is the mirror site of Terminus 2049, and it was already censored and banned by the Chinese internet, but there's other mirror sites that you can access. There are also other similar projects featuring women and workers under the corona crisis, and also projects that discuss the situations of using GitHub as a way to organize digital activism. So how does GitHub become a platform for Chinese citizens and activists to preserve counter-narratives and to make sense of the accountability and legitimation of the government? To begin with, the software development website GitHub is accessible in China for its function of code sharing. The platform gains its visibility outside the developer communities because in 2019, the anti-996 movement. This movement is initiated by the Chinese programmers protesting against the excessive working conditions in tech companies. As part of the movement, the 996 ICU project was devoted to compiling a list of tech companies that follows a 996 working schedule, which means from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. After mainstream media's reporting on this and the widespread discussion about 996 working culture in China, the movement has brought people's attention to GitHub itself as a suitable site for civic participation and a tactical choice for organizing contemporary activism in China, given its capacity to be operated both within and beyond the Great Firewall. Current studies of digital activism has primarily focused on network publics organized on social media platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and lately TikTok. GitHub and its affordances and its capacity to organize social movement are still underexplored. I think it would be valuable to attend to this alternative use of GitHub and to consider the roles and positions of developers in civic societies, and how could the experiences of organizing resistance with GitHub be applied to other social contexts. Let's move on to the second case, which is a creative media project, Qingming, a sculpture of resilience. I will first quickly show you how does the project look like. Qingming Festival is a day to mourn and commemorate ancestors and the lost loved ones. And this new media project invites visitors to virtually join a counterclockwise walk in front of the Hongshan Auditorium in Wuhan. The trajectory left by the visitors will be transformed into this online monument, representing a collective will of remembering how the officials were trying to silence the warning of coronavirus in Wuhan. As strongly stated in their website, we shall never forget our pain and tear. Neither should we stop examining the systematic problems exposed during the crisis, the strive for a better future. And as we all know, the political environment and the strict monitor and censorship voluntarily conducted by Chinese social media platforms hampers the possibilities for organizing physical protests or forming grassroots collectives physically. And in this project, we witness a creative way of resistance that could go beyond the restriction of holding protests physically. New media art project like this, and with its very effective sound design, holds the effective capacities to influence the visitors and remind them to remember the counter narrative. And what I want to say is I'm being cautious about not to claim these forms of collectivity in the crisis can represent the whole social picture. Yet I still would like to believe the diverse forms of resistance towards censorship will be able to maintain and evolve into the future and to resist and confront dominant narrative. That's all I want to say today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kinoko Merini, and also for the beautiful slide deck, and of course for your very important contribution to the book. I just published also on Twitter the link to the original post by Kinoko Merini for a quick reading on the fly. And now we go to our second author, who's going to take us instead to India. I'm going to try to pronounce your name. Please correct me because I practiced but not long enough, probably. So Shwomo Das. The floor is yours.
Yeah, yes, Shwomo is. Yeah.
Thank you for your kindness.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining here today. I'm Shomo. I'm a PhD student in management at Lyon Business School in France. Firstly, thank you to Stefania, Emiliano, Sylvia, and the Global Digital Culture Initiative at UVA for this fantastic project. What I will be doing today is I'll discuss the narrative surrounding the digital contact tracing app in India called Arogya Setu. Just a heads up, when I wrote the article, which is part of the book chapter, it was written in May and a lot of changes have taken place since. So in this presentation, I'll try to incorporate some of the changes which have taken place, and I'll try to see how it works. So quickly, contact tracing and digital apps, the historical background, if I have to put it that way. It kind of started post the pandemic with the World Health Organization saying that contact tracing is a very key component of infection monitoring. And but this is where they started, and the narrative which went towards the digitalization of this process started very soon, sometime around the month of February, with trying to digitalize some of the practices to efficiently detect people who have been in close contact with infected individuals. And this started the whole narrative. A lot of apps started coming out around the world. I'm just putting some of them, but as of January 2021, there were roughly 44 different apps which I could find. And you had two anti-COVID in France, today although in Brazil, Arogya Setu India, then Corona Tracer, BD, Bangladesh, and there were like lots of apps, and each app having its own architecture, own way of doing things. What we'll focus today, however, is on the Arogya Setu and its particular functioning and process. So these are screenshots from the very early days. The government of India launched the Arogya Setu on the 2nd of April 2020, at a time when the cases were too big, but too big back then meant 500 cases. And back then the narrative was that it was devised by the National Informatics Center, and it was a pretty big success. If you're talking about number of adoptions, it peaked significantly, and but come May, middle of May, around the time when we also wrote the article, policymakers, lawyers, activists, journalists had started questioning the workings of this app and the problems associated with it. And before we dive into that, I'll just give a small idea about how the app works. The architecture is quite complex, but on the inside, but on the outside, it's essentially it works on smartphones, has either iOS or Android. It works on 11 different regional languages, and some of the tech which it uses include the Bluetooth, GPS, and telecommunications. The Bluetooth to measure contact with other infected individuals, GPS to track your location, and telecommunication essentially to relay data to service centers, data centers. And the app requires, when you sign up for the app, it requires you to input personal information, for example, your name, age, gender, health status, and travel history. And based on this, they provide two things. First, a unique identifier number for every single individual, and a COVID-19 status. It can be positive, negative, high, or low. And this is the very, let's say, user end, what you can see. But within it, there exist like multiple layers of problems, some of which I'll be discussing in this presentation. So at the very basic level, the problems which arise in terms of design, if I have to put it that way, first of all, the app was developed only for smartphone users. And as of 2020, June, according to Statistica, I think there were 31.7% of the population had access to mobile phones, which is pretty less. And secondly, the app kind of worked in a way where people had been given, initially, they had been given the choice to use the app. So there was also a question of whether people were willing to adopt the app or not. And thirdly, given the fact that the app was asking people to input their own data, the question of correctness of data was questioned from the very beginning. And these three form the very basic crux of problems. which later on started getting more murky as more people started questioning the workings of the apps. For example, if I'm breaking it roughly into three categories, the first one was of privacy. Like, India does not really have a comprehensive data privacy law, and accordingly, there was no disclosure of who had access to the data, the personal data of people. Similar in terms of security, there is no comprehensive data protection law. At least it was not. There was no law such that back when the app was launched, and so there was no disclosure in terms of where data is stored. And in terms of knowledge, there was no disclosure of the algorithm which was being used to define people as positive, negative, high risk, or low risk, and how the app actually worked. And more importantly, there was no clarification of who designed the algorithm in itself. And comes the last stage of the what could be implications, and like where it eventually ended up being. The first one was of voluntary adoption. It was when the app was introduced, people were told that it will be voluntary. You can choose to download, install, and use the app. But then it started getting increasingly like that was the only way to do things. Things have, again, progressed back a bit, but by and large, most places still focus on using the app. For example, for commute or regional movements, apps started gaining absolute requirement around the month of May. Airport station entry, which still is going on. And by the time the situation had normalized to a certain extent, when workplaces were opening up, they were kind of pushing for people to have this app installed on their phones and to show it when they were entering the workplaces. And these are both for state and for private firms. And according to a few reports, it was a policy mandate which didn't really get much of media attention somehow. And the second, and this was what happened in practice. And the second thing which a lot of people raised the question was of possible centralization, given the fact that everyone was given a unique identifier number, and that I think a significant, almost 99% of Indians today probably have the Aadhaar ID, which is the national ID. There were chances and that these two would be linked, and greater chance of this being linked because the app requires your mobile number, which is linked with your Aadhaar. So it was not a very difficult step for a data scientist to actually link these two. And as of now, we don't really know whether it has been linked or not, but with the new vaccine which is coming in, it's definitely going to be linked with the Arogya Setu app. And so these are the certain problems which obviously are being faced by people and which might be occurring going forward. And so we tried to link it with a broader perspective within which the group works. The questions came so if this app is being brought out, in terms of questions of access and representation, it becomes a question, who gets represented? Of course, when you're talking about smartphone users, it kind of implies that people who have smartphones can only be represented by the practices of this app. Then comes the role of individual agency. People, do they have agency to represent themselves, or do they not have anything? Are they forced to do so? The question of privacy and security comes next, as to who owns, accesses, and uses the data. These are big questions which have come up after this particular project. And then comes if I'm putting it in third, with the implications. The question comes, what is the data used for, and what is the implication of both representation and non-representation? And these are some of the broader questions from the perspective of looking at the fairness in which people are treated as a representation of their data. And that throws up a lot of questions for people working in social policy, international development, as to what exactly are the implications of such apps, which raises question at every single level. And a fun thing which came out, Indian government initially mentioned that the app was developed by the NIC, which was a government player, but it was quite a long time, but eventually it came out that it was a public-private partnership, and that raises even more question as to, okay, so who has access to the data? So there was very limited clarification on any of these processes. A lot of it is being redressed of late, but still there are multiple gaps which exist in this narrative. And I'll not take more of your time. Yes, feel free to ask questions, and thank you all for stopping.
Thank you so much, Romeo, and apologies again for mispronouncing your name, no matter how much I practice, for taking us to India and exposing some of the many challenges associated with the pandemic of the Datafied Society in this case, in non-Western countries. Thank you very much, Sylvia. I guess in the interest of time, we leave it at that again, but there's much more to discuss. But indeed, this is just the beginning of a conversation. And the book is a way to create a collective memory, because eventually the blog might disappear from the web, but it's not the end of the conversation. On the contrary, it's really literally just a start.